They mocked the old pianist the moment he shuffled into the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Hotel. His outdated suit hung loose on his frail frame, a coffee stain visible on the lapel. The wedding guests exchanged glances, some stifling laughs behind champagne flutes, others whispering behind manicured hands. The father of the groom, once a celebrated concert pianist, now reduced to this, a trembling old man who couldn't even dress properly for his only son's wedding. "That's him? That's the famous father we've heard so much about?" a bridesmaid whispered loudly enough for half the room to hear. "I thought he was supposed to be some kind of musical genius." The wedding planner rushed over, clipboard clutched to her chest, panic flashing in her eyes as she assessed the situation. This was not part of her meticulously organized timeline. The five-star venue, the string quartet, the champagne fountain. Everything was perfect until this disheveled old man appeared, threatening to disrupt the elegant atmosphere she had crafted for months. Would you have stood up for him or joined the crowd looking away? Tell us in the comments. But no one in that ballroom could have possibly anticipated what would happen when those weathered fingers finally touched the keys of the grand piano that stood waiting at the center of the room. The old man's name was Thomas Harrington, 67 years old, widowed for 5 years, and tonight was the wedding of his only child, James. Thomas stood awkwardly by the entrance, feeling the weight of every stare, every whispered comment. His arthritic fingers clutched a worn leather folder, sheet music he'd carried for 40 years, now yellowed with age. "Dad!" James appeared suddenly beside him, handsome in his tailored tuxedo, a stark contrast to his father's appearance. "You made it!" There was relief in his voice, but also tension. They'd argued yesterday about this very moment. "I told you I would," Thomas said quietly, his eyes scanning the opulent ballroom. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, tables adorned with floral arrangements that probably cost more than his monthly pension. "Though I'm not sure I belong here." James squared his shoulders, that familiar determination hardening his features. "You belong exactly here. This was her idea, remember?" Thomas felt his throat tighten at the mention of her. Elizabeth, his wife, James's mother, gone now for 5 years. But her presence still lingered between father and son like an unspoken promise. And if stories of fathers who refuse to give up move you, subscribe now. More powerful stories every week. Thomas Harrington had once been the pride of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, his talents spoken of in reverent tones throughout the classical music world. His hands could coax emotions from ivory keys that left audiences breathless, but that was before arthritis twisted his fingers into painful claws, before the medical bills depleted their savings, before Elizabeth was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. The last performance Thomas ever gave was not in a concert hall, but in a hospital room, playing Elizabeth's favorite Chopin nocturne on a digital keyboard propped on her bed while she drifted away from him. He had promised her then, whispering into her ear as the monitors beeped around them, that he would play at James's wedding someday. "Our boy will find someone wonderful," she had whispered back, her voice barely audible, "and you'll play for both of us." After she was gone, Thomas sold their house to pay the remaining medical bills. He moved into a small apartment and took a job teaching piano to beginners at a community center. His hands hurt too much to play anything complex anymore, but he could still demonstrate simple scales and basic compositions to children fumbling through their first lessons. But the promise to Elizabeth remained. Through the years, as James grew into his career as an architect, as he met Catherine, the elegant art curator who would become his fiancée, Thomas practiced in secret. One piece, just one special piece that he would play at their wedding, for Elizabeth. When James and Catherine began planning their wedding, Thomas offered to play. James had hesitated. "Dad, your hands, are you sure?" "One song," Thomas had insisted, "for your mother." Catherine's parents were paying for the wedding, a lavish affair befitting their social standing. They'd hired a renowned wedding planner who'd booked a string quartet for the ceremony and a 12-piece band for the reception. There was no space in the carefully choreographed event for an old man with arthritic hands to fumble through a piano piece. But James had stood firm. "My father plays one song. It's non-negotiable." Now, as Thomas stood awkwardly at the entrance of the ballroom, he could feel the disapproval radiating from Catherine's mother, Vivian, who approached with a tight smile. "Thomas, we weren't sure you'd make it," she said, eyes critically assessing his appearance. "The ceremony was beautiful. What a shame you missed it." Thomas felt a flush of embarrassment. His bus had been delayed, and then he'd gotten lost in the massive hotel. By the time he found the chapel, the ceremony was over. Another failure to add to his growing list. "I'm sorry I was late," he said softly. Vivian's smile didn't reach her eyes. "Well, you're here now, though perhaps you'd like to freshen up before dinner is served." James stepped between them. "Dad's fine, Vivian. He's here to play, remember?" Thomas saw the flash of annoyance cross his future mother-in-law's face. "Yes, well, the band is scheduled to start in 20 minutes. Perhaps during their first break. We've paid quite a premium for them, and the timeline is rather tight." The wedding planner appeared at Vivian's elbow, nodding vigorously. "The first dance is immediately after dinner, then the band's first set. Maybe between sets would work better?" Thomas felt himself shrinking, becoming smaller with each word. Perhaps this had been a mistake. Perhaps he should quietly slip away, take the bus back to his apartment, forget this foolish promise made to a ghost. "No," James said firmly, his voice cutting through the chatter. "My father will play after dinner, before the first dance. That was always the plan." Catherine appeared beside them, radiant in her wedding dress, a vision that momentarily took Thomas's breath away. She looked so much like Elizabeth had on their wedding day, the same graceful neck, the same kind eyes. "Thomas," she said warmly, leaning in to kiss his cheek, "I'm so glad you're here. James told me about the special song." Thomas felt tears threatening. This girl, this woman, who barely knew him, showing him more kindness in one moment than he'd felt in years. "Thank you," he managed to say. "I've been practicing." Catherine slipped her arm through his. "Come sit with us at the head table. I want to hear all about James as a little boy. He refuses to show me the childhood photos." As Catherine led him through the ballroom, Thomas was acutely aware of the stairs. The coffee stain on his jacket felt like a beacon. His rented shoes pinched his feet. He didn't belong in this world of wealth and privilege that his son had somehow entered. But for Elizabeth, he would endure this. For the promise he had made as she slipped away from him, he would play one last time. Dinner passed in a blur of unfamiliar foods and stilted conversation. Thomas sat beside James, picking at his plate, aware of Vivian's critical gaze from across the table. The wine flowed freely, but Thomas didn't drink. He needed his hands to be steady. When the plates were cleared, the wedding planner approached the microphone set up near the dance floor. "Ladies and gentlemen, before our bride and groom share their first dance, we have a special musical interlude." Her voice was professional, but Thomas caught the brief grimace she couldn't quite hide. "The father of the groom will play a piece on the piano." A polite smattering of applause followed as Thomas rose from his seat. James squeezed his shoulder. "You've got this, Dad." Thomas made his way to the grand piano that dominated one corner of the ballroom. It was a magnificent instrument, a Steinway concert grand that probably cost more than he had earned in a decade. He sat gingerly on the bench, adjusting it slightly, aware of the expectant hush that had fallen over the room. His hands trembled as he placed them on the keys. The pain was immediate, sharp jolts shooting through his swollen knuckles. For a moment, he froze, panic rising in his throat. What if he couldn't do it? What if he embarrassed James in front of all these people? He glanced up and saw his son watching him, Catherine beside him, her hand resting on James's arm. And for just a moment, Thomas thought he saw Elizabeth standing behind them, her smile encouraging as it had always been. Thomas took a deep breath and began to play. The first notes of Claude Debussy's Clair de Lune filled the ballroom. His fingers moved slowly at first, tentatively finding their way across the familiar landscape of ivory. Each press of a key sent pain shooting through his hands, but Thomas pushed through it, focusing on the melody that had been Elizabeth's favorite. A wrong note, then another. Thomas winced, his confidence faltering. He heard murmurs from the crowd, saw Vivian's pained expression, the wedding planner's barely concealed horror. But then he closed his eyes, shutting them all out. He wasn't playing for them. He was playing for Elizabeth, for James, for the promise made 5 years ago in a hospital room scented with antiseptic and death. As the piece progressed, something remarkable happened. The pain in Thomas's hands seemed to recede, not gone, but somehow less important than the music flowing through him. His fingers found their strength, their memory, their purpose. The notes began to soar, pure and clear, filling every corner of the silent ballroom. Thomas opened his eyes and saw James watching him, tears streaming unashamedly down his face. Catherine beside him, clutching his arm, equally moved. Even Vivian appeared stunned, her earlier disdain replaced with something like wonder. Would you have the courage to perform despite the pain and judgment, or would you back down? Let us know in the comments. As the final notes of Clair de Lune faded into silence, Thomas remained still, his hands hovering above the keys. For a moment, no one moved, no one spoke. It was as if the entire room was holding its breath. Then James stood up, applauding fiercely, tears still wet on his cheeks. Catherine rose beside him, then their friends, then table by table, the entire wedding party was on their feet. The applause thundered through the ballroom, punctuated by calls of "Bravo" and "Encore." Thomas sat stunned. He hadn't expected this reaction. He had only wanted to fulfill his promise to Elizabeth, to play one last time for his son's wedding. He hadn't expected to reconnect with the musician he used to be, hadn't expected to feel the music flowing through him again after so many years of silence. As the applause continued, James approached the piano, Catherine beside him. "Dad," James said, his voice thick with emotion, "that was incredible." Thomas looked up at his son, seeing not the successful architect in an expensive tuxedo, but the little boy who used to sit beside him on the piano bench, watching in awe as his father practiced. "I promised your mother," he said simply. Catherine wiped a tear from her cheek. "It was beautiful, Thomas, truly beautiful." Then James did something unexpected. He turned to face their guests, raising his hands for quiet. When the applause finally subsided, he spoke into the microphone that had been set up nearby. "Ladies and gentlemen, my father, Thomas Harrington." Another round of applause, during which Thomas nodded awkwardly, unsure what to do with this sudden attention. "What you just heard," James continued, "was played by a man who once performed with the Boston Symphony Orchestra, a man who gave up his career to care for my mother during her illness. A man who taught piano to children for minimum wage to pay off medical bills after she was gone." Thomas felt his face flush with embarrassment. He hadn't told James about the medical bills, about selling the house. He'd wanted to protect his son from those worries. "My father made a promise to my mother before she died," James went on, his voice catching, "that he would play at my wedding, despite arthritis that makes it painful for him to even button his own shirt. Despite not having touched a piano like this in years, he kept that promise tonight." The room was utterly silent now, every guest hanging on James's words. "Catherine and I have an announcement to make," James said, turning to smile at his bride. "We've decided to make a change to our gift registry." Murmurs of surprise rippled through the crowd. The registry at Bloomingdale's had been meticulously curated by Catherine and Vivian. "Instead of the gifts you so generously planned to give us, we're asking for donations toward establishing a music scholarship in my mother's name," The Elizabeth Harrington Memorial Scholarship will provide piano lessons to children who couldn't otherwise afford them, taught by none other than my father. Thomas felt the room spin around him. This was the first he was hearing of this plan. About teaching. Catherine leaned down to speak directly to Thomas. "We've already found a space," she said softly. "A beautiful studio near your apartment with 3 pianos. We signed the lease last week." Thomas couldn't speak. The lump in his throat was too big, the emotions too overwhelming. "And Dad," James added, kneeling beside the piano bench so they were eye to eye, "we want you to play at the opening. Not just one song, a whole concert, whatever you want to play." Thomas shook his head, holding up his gnarled hands. "I can't," he whispered. My hands." "We've found a specialist," Catherine said. "Dr. Abernathy at Mass General. He's pioneering a new treatment for arthritis in musicians. Insurance won't cover it. But that's what the wedding gifts are really for," James finished. "Not just the scholarship, but your treatment too." Thomas looked from his son to his new daughter-in-law, unable to process what they were saying. After years of pain, of limitation, of loss, could there really be a second chance waiting for him? "Play one last song for her," James said, gesturing to the piano. "Not for Mom this time. For Catherine, for your new daughter." Thomas looked at Catherine, who nodded encouragingly. Then he turned back to the keys, flexing his painful fingers. One more song. He could manage one more song. He began to play again, this time choosing Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, letting the haunting melody fill the room. As he played, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in 5 years. Hope. Hope that maybe his life wasn't over. Hope that music might return to him in a way he had thought impossible. Hope that Elizabeth's legacy would live on, not just in memory, but in the music he could teach to others. The wedding guests watched in reverent silence as the old man at the piano, no longer looking shabby or out of place, transformed before their eyes into the master musician he had once been. The pain was still there in his hands, but it was overshadowed now by something stronger: purpose. When the final notes faded away, there was no immediate applause. Instead, a moment of profound silence filled the ballroom, as if no one wanted to break the spell that had been cast. Then Catherine stepped forward, tears streaming down her face, and embraced Thomas. "Thank you," she whispered, "for sharing your gift with us, for raising the man I love, for being here today." As the applause finally erupted around them, Thomas saw Vivian approaching, her earlier disdain replaced with something like respect. "I had no idea," she said, offering her hand to Thomas. "James told us you were a pianist, but that was extraordinary." The wedding planner hovered nearby, her timeline forgotten, her clipboard hanging limply at her side. "Mr. Harrington," she said, "would you consider playing again later? Perhaps during the cake cutting, or whenever you feel up to it. The band wouldn't mind at all." Thomas looked up at James, who was beaming with pride. "What do you think, Dad? Up for an encore later?" Thomas flexed his fingers, feeling the familiar pain, but also a new determination. "I think I might be," he said, "for family." As the evening continued, Thomas found himself surrounded by guests eager to speak with him, to hear about his career, to express their admiration for his performance. The coffee stain on his jacket was forgotten. The outdated suit no longer seemed to matter. They saw him now, really saw him, not as the shabby old man who had shuffled in late, but as the gifted musician who had moved them to tears. Later, as the band took a break, Thomas sat at the piano again. This time, he played jazz standards, lighter pieces that had the guests swaying and smiling. His fingers still hurt, but the pain seemed less important now. He watched as James and Catherine danced, their faces glowing with happiness, and he felt Elizabeth's presence more strongly than he had in years. You would love her, he thought, imagining Elizabeth watching their son with his new bride. You would love the woman he's chosen. As the evening drew to a close, James and Catherine prepared to leave for their honeymoon. They found Thomas sitting quietly at an empty table, watching the remaining guests with a contented smile. "Dad," James said, sitting beside him, "thank you for everything." Thomas squeezed his son's hand. "I should be thanking you. What you've done, the scholarship, the doctor, it's too much." "It's not enough," James replied. "Not after everything you sacrificed for us." Catherine joined them, having changed from her wedding gown into a traveling outfit. "The studio will be ready when you get back from your treatment," she said. "We've already had calls from parents interested in lessons for their children." Thomas shook his head in wonder. "I never thought I'd teach proper lessons again. I never thought I'd play like that again." "Mom knew," James said softly. "That's why she made you promise to play at my wedding. She knew it would bring you back to music." Thomas felt tears welling up again. Elizabeth had always seen more in him than he saw in himself. Even at the end, she had been thinking of his future, of how to guide him back to the passion he had set aside for her sake. As James and Catherine prepared to depart, Thomas walked them to the hotel entrance. The night air was cool, stars visible above the city lights. A limousine waited to take the newlyweds to the airport. "We'll call you from Bali," James promised, embracing his father one last time. "You've given me back my music," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "There are no words to thank you for that." Catherine hugged him next. "Play while we're gone," she urged. "Every day. Build up your strength for when you start teaching." Thomas nodded. "I will, I promise." As the limousine pulled away, Thomas stood watching until its taillights disappeared around a corner. Then he turned back toward the hotel, where the last of the wedding guests were departing. A new chapter was beginning, not just for James and Catherine, but for him too. In his pocket, he felt the folded program from the wedding, where his name had been printed alongside the string quartet and the band. "Special performance by Thomas Harrington, father of the groom." He would keep this, just as he had kept the program from his last concert with the Boston Symphony, just as he had kept the small digital recording of himself playing for Elizabeth in her hospital room. Markers of a life filled with music, with love, with loss, and now, unexpectedly, with renewal. Thomas took a deep breath of the night air and made his way back into the hotel. Tomorrow, he would return to his small apartment and begin practicing in earnest. There was a new specialist to see, a new studio to prepare for, new students to teach. But tonight, he would remember how it felt to fulfill a promise made 5 years ago, how it felt to honor Elizabeth's memory, how it felt to connect with his son in a way words could never achieve. How it felt to have music flow through his painful hands and out into a room full of strangers who, for a brief moment, became family, connected by the universal language of melody. They had mocked him when he entered the ballroom, but they had wept when he played. And in that transformation lay a truth more powerful than any judgment. Never dismiss someone based on appearance alone. For beneath the surface may lie gifts beyond imagining. If this story moved you, subscribe now for more powerful stories every week. And click on the video on the screen to watch the next one with a twist so powerful you'll never forget it.